Welcome everybody to Sunday school. In the past, to anyone who may have been away, we have done the first three chapters of Matthew. We've covered Jesus's lineage, his birth, the gifts of the Magi. They went to Egypt. They've come back to Nazareth. Now Jesus is 30, done his stint in the desert. He's John the Baptist baptized him. He's been tempted. He called the fishermen last week. So I think I realized in preparation for this lesson more than those in the past, the importance of etymology for any of you that are into word history, word development, what words mean. If you like etymology, where words come from in Aramaic, Greek, Latin, what have you, this book by William Barclay is essential because it really goes into the etymology. Very heavy on that this week. And if you're not interested in it, I'm not going to go into all the detail. I mean, being an educator, I like etymology, but I come from a Sunday school class where they really don't. So I'm not going to bore you with all the detail, but if you like that, this book is really good for word history.
Most of this group also loves it, and that's why we pick these books, because we do love it as well.
Well, then go ahead, Susan.
Oh, I was just going to say that for those of you who did not purchase the books, the text of the books is available online, all of it. And so I have a link to that text on the webpage, the Matthew webpage.
All right, so I'm going to pick up on page 88 of the book with the calling of disciples. Does someone want to read Matthew chapter 4, 18 to 22?
I got it.
Thank you.
So while he was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting their net into the sea, for they were fishermen. He said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." They immediately left their nets and followed him. He went on from there and saw two other brothers, James, Zebedee's son, and John, his brother. They were in the boat with Zebedee, their father, getting ready their nets for use. So he called them. They immediately left their boat and their father and followed him.
The text after this talks about the Sea of Galilee, and it's a very small lake as far as what we're accustomed to. It's very small, and it's 680 feet below sea level. So I Googled, because I Google everything. I probably use Google more times a day than any normal person. And if you Google the Sea of Galilee and look at the borders, it's like an escarpment. It's like the cliffs of Dover in England. When the airplanes were coming back, they have to go up those white chalk cliffs. I mean, it is a 680-foot cliff around some of the Sea of Galilee.
Oh, wow.
It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And Barclay talks about how it's one of the, because of the presence of the water, it's beautiful countryside, very fertile land, and one of the loveliest lakes in the world, even though it's very, very tiny. And he talked about back in the day, at this time, there were 9 populous cities on the shore. So because they made their living by fishing and they needed water to grow crops, towns developed, which, you know, we're accustomed to that because most cities in the US cropped up on rivers. But in the 1930s, only the city of Tiberias was left. So for whatever reason, I guess they found ways to dig wells. And I remember my mom talking about years ago when Israel was created, that it was just a desert, and who in their right mind would take a bunch of desert land but they found a way to get water out there, and there's minerals in the soil. So the land is fertile. You just have to get water to it. So, but there's only one city as of the 1930s, Tiberias, around the Sea of Galilee. Has anybody visited? Anybody done the Holy Land visit and been there? Because it sounds really small.
I was there, I just don't remember it. I was too young.
Oh, okay.
I don't know about that specific area, but there was a professor at VCU years ago, Dr. Talbot, who was an Egyptologist, and he showed us things that whole Nile River Valley. You know, we think of a lot of it as being desert, and it is now, but at that time it was really lush trees, and you know, there are fossilized tree stumps there and everything. It's
Right.
quite different now.
Yeah, well, the Bible talks about oases in Sinai. So I guess between the oases, the bodies of water, it is kind of desert-like. But when Israel got it as a country, they were able to pipe water in and make it into rich, fertile farmland. So there's minerals there to be had. Then Barclay goes into talking about fishermen. And how the things you need to be good at to be a fisherman, you also need to be fishers of men, disciples. And I thought that analogy was very interesting. So I enjoyed this part of the lesson very much. Later on, we get into etymology, and I felt like I was walking in quicksand. But this part I found very interesting. So on page 89, it talks about there are 3 ways to fish. You can fish, of course, with a line. You can fish with a casting net, which is round or oval, and it's got the weights, and you throw it out and it sinks down and surrounds the fish, and then you pull it back up with the fish trapped inside. Or you can seine, you can drag net, where you have a net between 2 boats and you pull it, and then you pull in what you capture in the net. And so he talks about how there are ways to fish, and the talent you have to have as a fisherman are the same talent you have to have to get disciples. Let's see, this is not, we are not to think that this is the first time Jesus saw these fishermen. I always wondered, why in the world did Peter, James, and John, and Andrew just drop their nets with their dad and go off and follow Jesus? I'm like, but I didn't realize, you know, as a younger person, this wasn't the first time they had seen or heard Jesus. It says, and they were simple, working people, and it was ordinary people that Jesus chose. And he talks about that on page 90 in the book. Those who are good at fishing must possess these very qualities, which will make them equally good at catching people. And then it talks on page 91, you have to have patience. You have to be able to wait. My husband's been fishing many a day and come back with nothing, and I'm not so sure he was really fishing. I think he was waiting.
You drink a lot of beer.
Number 2, you have to have perseverance. You have to be willing to try and try and try again, because lots of times you pull back the hook and there's no worm on it. Number 3, you have to have courage. You have to be willing to take a risk. I don't know about you guys, but some of the best religious conversations I've had have been with strangers, people in my profession, not family members so much. So you have to be willing to take a risk. Number 4, you have to have an eye for the right moment. I know you fish for catfish at night, and most fishermen fish early morning, later in the afternoon, not during the heat of the midday. You have to know where the water currents are, where the shade is, water temperature, pH, all of that. So you have to know something about having an eye for the right moment. You have to fit the bait to the fish. You can't beat people over the head. I often wonder how successful those street preachers are that are barking on street corners. It made me think of that with number 5. I wouldn't think that would be a very successful method. People yelling at me is not going to get my attention and make me receptive. Other thoughts on that?
It reminds me of the story of of sowing the grain also, though.
Yeah.
So those preachers, when they're sowing, a lot of it's going to land on, rock. And there's some places where it might take fruit.
I don't know. I always thought that parable was so wasteful, but I grew up on a farm with a dad that lived through the Depression. And I don't know if you ever grew up with anybody that lived during the Depression. Good Lord.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of teaching too, that the teacher's in front of a class and giving this information and one of them's back there sleeping or, whatever.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting encounters I ever saw was at VCU. There was one of those people that would stand up on a stump and beat you over the head with a Bible. And Rabbi Jack Shapiro walked up, who knows more about the Bible than all of us and Christianity. And that was an interesting encounter.
You stayed for the entertainment factor?
I was actually watching most of it from my office, but I could
Uh.
have the sign language. This guy was in over his head.
Very quickly, probably. Number 5, you have to fit the bait to the fish. So you have to my mind, you have to wait for the right moment. It says, wise preachers and teachers know that the same approach will not win everyone. The first day of teaching, all of my 20 years that I taught and then 12 as admin, I did a questionnaire. And one of the questions was, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, because I know all of you don't want to be biology teachers. And when I found kids that wanted to do music or plumbing or bricklaying or something else, I really tried not to push if they were, off task and doing other stuff, because very few people in the room want to study the subject you're teaching. And you just have to realize that they're just trying to get through the class like I was doing in philosophy at Longwood. Oh my gosh. Oh, just give me a C and let me go on. Oh, but
That's
other
what
people,
I was saying in biology in college.
well, I love dead animals, all the parts, the muscles, the nerves, how they work, why they work, how the food you eat affects how they work. I love that, but gosh, don't make me study Kant and all of those people. Well, how do you know you're alive? I don't care. I pinch myself. It hurts.
I was told all I learned in chemistry was how to make tea in a beaker.
Yeah. Jason had a roommate that majored in philosophy, and Jason said the conversations, he just sat there and never understood a thing that came out of his mouth. On the next page, number 6, in order to be a good fisherman or fisher of people, you have to keep yourselves out of sight. So not hide so much as it says present men and women not with themselves, but with Christ. So you don't sell yourself, you're selling Christ. And you shouldn't be like Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. You shouldn't be leading people to you. You should be leading people to Christ.
Right.
So any other thoughts about those 6 traits to be good fishermen that also would make you good disciples? I like that list. That list is worth studying.
I've often thought also it tells you a lot about Christ, who he wanted to hang around with, because fishermen are not sissies. They're men's men. I mean, they're calloused, they're hardened in the sun. I mean, these men are not, like I say, they're the toughest of the tough, and that's who Jesus enjoyed hanging around with. And if they hung around with him, he wasn't a sissy either. I mean, it's just, it tells you a lot about the type of people both groups were.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent observation. Thank you, Harold. All right, someone want to read our next selection, Matthew chapter 4, 23 through 25.
I got it.
Thanks, Sarah.
Jesus made a circular tour of Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of diseases and ailments among the people. And the report of his activities went out all over Syria. So they brought to him all those who were ill, those who were in the grip of the most varied diseases and pains, those who were possessed by demons, those who were epileptics, and those who were paralyzed, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and from the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem, and from Judea, and from beyond Jordan.
I learned a lot in this section, starting with the synagogue was the most important institution in the life of any Jew, but there was only one temple. There were lots of synagogues, but only one temple. And the temple was in Jerusalem and strictly for offering sacrifices. I know there's the temple in Jerusalem and all the rest were called synagogues, but I never thought about what that meant.
There's a synagogue for every 10 families. That's all.
Wow. And I guess, Harold, that's so they could fit in a home or a small place.
Well, I assume, but in the cities and things, I read somewhere, and I'm sure it's true, because I read it on the internet, but it seemed to be sort of, about every 10 families were enough and they would have a synagogue, which primarily was, they sort of were like the Quakers in a way. They took turns preaching or talking. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
So there were a
Well,
lot of synagogues.
and you like a small Sunday school class or church or synagogue, to my mind, if you're going to be actively participating, you learn a lot more in small group than you do in big group.
Well,
Does
that
it
gets
become-
me, yeah, that gets me thinking, Harold, what you're saying then in the early church, meeting in people's homes, if there was a synagogue for every 10 families. So in the Jewish community, they were accustomed, it sounds like, to meeting in small groups.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think
So
that's
that
true.
format would have carried over into
That's
the early
true.
church.
Well, I mean, I guess, the early church were Jews that just started believing in Christ. So, they didn't
They
change
met
it.
in
Right.
homes.
But
too.
but Gentiles were being pretty quickly incorporated also. But for the Jews to carry that over into the early church. I don't know.
I have a question regarding the term family. I mean, when we hear the term family, we think nuclear family. And back then it might have been extended family, which is not going to be 7 to 10 people. It could be 20, 40, 60 people in a family with a patriarch.
Right. Well, in some cultures, even today, Nancy, the woman joins the man's family. I know in China, in the Muslim faith, and I'm not sure about others, but you literally move to the man's house and live there, because I've read all kinds of biographies people have written, and you join the other family, and if they don't like you, your life can be very difficult. At the top of page 93, it says the temple was only for the offering of sacrifices, and synagogues were essentially teaching institutions. And there was a set synagogue service. There was like a president of the synagogue. So it's like small group teaching. The first part consisted of prayers. The second part consisted of readings from the law and the prophets. The third part was the address, and no one person gave the address. Like Harold said, anybody could participate and get up and speak. Now you had to have the okay from the president of that synagogue. You had to be knowledgeable and learned. You couldn't just get up there and spout off. There was no such thing as professional ministry. It's sort of like churches that are elder led, and the elders take turns preaching. There was no such thing as a professional ministry. The president of the synagogue presided over the arrangements for the service. Any distinguished stranger could be asked to give the address. And if the president of the synagogue judged him to be a fit person to speak, he was allowed to speak. So when Jesus would go to these different towns, the pulpit's basically open. All he had to do was, by participating when other people spoke, they could tell that he was very learned. So he then in turn was allowed to speak. And then after the speaker speaks, then there's discussion, talk. I would love that format. I would really like small group. And I never had one class at Longwood that was auditorium style, because I went in as a biology major. So I never did biology 101. I did botany and zoology my freshman year, which were small group. I never had a class over 30 at Longwood. And it was wonderful. We all got to know each other by name. We all moved through together, and a much better way to learn. I really like going to a small college and learned a lot. Thoughts about this whole, would we like a church like that with no minister where the elders rotate speaking?
I guess my question back then, were the women even allowed to speak at the end?
The women weren't allowed in the synagogue. Yeah, you had to stay in the outer. Harold, help us here. What were the women allowed to do?
I think they were segregated one side to the other. I think they were allowed in the synagogue.
Oh,
but
okay.
They were segregated. I believe that's true.
Could they speak?
I think you're right.
I'm not sure about that. I don't think so,
I
but I'm
don't-
not sure about that.
I don't think so. I think, like Harold said, I think the men were on one side, the women were on the other side. And if the women had questions or comments, they were supposed to wait until they got home and talk to their husbands in the privacy of their own home.
Wasn't there a movie Yentl that Barbara Streisand was in
Yes.
about that?
Yeah.
That she wanted to be learned and was learned and disguised. Wasn't the whole premise she disguised herself
Yes.
as a boy to speak and be a part
Yeah.
of that?
And her disguise was so successful, she actually got married because everybody thought she was male.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I read a book back in the spring called My Last Skirt, and it's about a girl in Ireland whose parents died, and she and her brother, as real story, as very young people, had to work like men, so she dressed like a man. People thought she was a man. Then they immigrated to the US, and she kept that up because she could have a man's job, make more money, have status, she could vote. She lived her whole life in the US as a man, entered the Civil War, fought, got a pension, and when she got injured, they discovered she was a woman and threw her in jail. Over here, it's a wonderful book. It's My Last Skirt, and it's about a woman who lived as a man because she got benefits. So,
Yeah, I
Yeah.
expect she was not the only person that did that.
there,
yeah.
yeah. So she was the first woman to vote, I think, one of the first women to vote, because she voted during the
Probably.
Civil War. Yeah.
Huh.
Let's see. I think I would really like the time for talking and all after I love to have discussions where you sit around and talk about a particular topic and you find out different books people have read. And
Well,
Then,
you
of
ought to come to our Sunday school class then.
I know,
Yeah.
but I'm trying to move my Sunday school class along a little bit. My Sunday school class is people who need to know more detail about the Bible before they can have the discussions you guys have. I would really enjoy your class.
We are.
Well, my class is still struggling. Now, who are the 12 disciples? And, they just aren't as knowledgeable, and they're okay with that, and I'm okay with that.
Yep.
Marianne Casdia is a faithful Catholic, but never learned anything about the Bible. The Catholic Church didn't have Sunday school when she was little in New York. And she said it's just shocking what she doesn't know about the Bible. So,
Yeah, Bud said it was all in Latin.
well, yeah.
It would have been for her.
Yeah. Let's see, where are we going? The next page, talks about on page 94, a legend. And because it was a legend, I'm not going to relay the whole thing to you. It's a legend. It's not even real, I don't think so, about people who came to Jesus. So if you want to read it, it's on page 94, but anybody want to discuss that or anything from it? Anybody that read it?
No.
Because it's a legend, I'm just not going into
Put
it.
in my notes.
Yeah. I mean, it was a cute little legend, but I kind of want to stick with the facts. On page, he does give lots of examples of things to support, and that's fine. On page 95, it talks about people came in the scripture. It says they came from Syria. And of course, Syria is all of the land north of Israel. It's just a huge north and east of Israel. It's just huge land. People came from Galilee. They came from Jerusalem, Judea. They came from the land across the Jordan. So east of the Jordan River is called Perea. and I think it's the country of Jordan now. They came from Decapolis, and Decapolis is way northwest of Israel. It's where Greece is today, but Deca, of course, is 10. So it was 10 cities that chose, probably for defense purposes, to work together. So it was a federation of 10 independent Greek cities. And then he mentions that not only Jews, but Gentiles came to Jesus already. And of course, you know, Jewish leaders had a real problem with Gentiles being there. Then he says, this passage is of great importance because it gives us, in brief summary, the 3 great activities of Jesus's life. So then he spends some time talking about preaching, teaching, and healing as the 3 activities in Jesus's life. And number 1, it says he came to proclaim the gospel. He came to defeat human ignorance by preaching. Then he says he came teaching in the synagogues. So he came to defeat our human misunderstandings. And then Barclay says he came healing. He came to defeat human pain. And I think early on, a lot of people came to Jesus just for the healing. They just, you know, they just wanted to be healed of whatever issues, some lifelong, that they had had. And then people probably stayed. Has anybody ever seen in writing, how big was the entourage that followed Jesus? I always assumed it was hundreds of people that followed him from place to place, sort of like groupies. The inner circle that included the women, you know, that fixed the food every day. And because when Judas kept the common purse, there were he needed money, because there were, as they moved around from city to city, there were people to feed every day. There were probably cloaks and shoes to buy and what have you. Does anybody know anything about the size of the group that moved around with Jesus?
I think you're right about being hundreds of people, because if you remember in John 6:50, when he was trying to explain what we call communion now, they thought he was actually talking about cannibalism, and hundreds of people just left. You know, they just departed from him because they misinterpreted it and thought he was talking about cannibalism.
Yeah, I always, just based on the adjectives and the plural, the way things are mentioned in plural.
Well, and at this time, we're talking about, I think somewhere in Barclay mentions that he made the circuit around the Sea of Galilee. And to hear about the quantity of people that were around that area, just because it was so fertile. And I think, you know, Sarah was even adding up the counts last week and saying there's no way that many people, you know, 240 villages with 15,000 plus people per village, you know, that many people fit in that area. But it is a very heavily populated area. It was a lot of different people from a lot of different places. We learned what we talked about last week. And so it's not, especially if you find out someone's healing someone, to bring in people from all around. So he was bringing in, it was like autumn in Gatlinburg, and everyone draws to the mountains for the trees. You know, I think that's what I kind of see that. So I see a lot of people coming, and it might not be the same people all the time.
Well, and don't we also assume that there were vendors coming in from the hinterlands, bringing in lambs and vegetables and olives and oil? And so there were people coming to the cities to sell their wares too. So at any given time, there were itinerant or temporary people there to sell goods and then go back home, I would assume.
Yeah. Sunglasses and umbrellas. And
Yeah.
Well, they said that, 4 of the disciples came from Capernaum, and that's where, of course, Jesus hung out a lot.
It was his home.
Well, it became his home. And that was only about 1,700 people, I have, again, read somewhere. So it wasn't thousands, it was about 1,700 there.
Well, if you think about, go ahead, Bud.
It may have been that if it's a circuit around Galilee and so forth, there may have been a contingency that traveled with him on a regular basis, but it may be that from location to location, there were groups of people who catered to the needs there, and then they moved to the next one, and that local group might, I don't know, it's like the farmer's market drops up here, and then the one in the next town, the farmer's market comes up or something. I don't know.
And I would imagine there were people whose job it was to do in the group to go ahead and find lodging, to find food.
I like moving an army.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, logistics, early logistics. Yeah. After we finish chapter 4, Barclay goes into quite some detail about the Sermon on the Mount pre-chapter 5. So on page 96, he starts talking about the Sermon on the Mount before we read chapter 5, and he talks about things you need to know about the Sermon on the Mount before you read it. So that's what we're going to probably end today's class with, the pre-Sermon on the Mount discussion, because the Sermon on the Mount is going to take a long time to get through. And it is the, I guess if you condense Jesus's teachings to the minimal, it's the Sermon on the Mount. And keep in mind that the disciples didn't have notes. They didn't have books. They had to keep in their mind everything they were to teach later. They didn't know that, but Jesus did. So the Sermon on the Mount, Barclay says at the top of page 97, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew shows us Jesus instructing his disciples in the message which was his. It's Jesus's message in which they were to take to the people. So it's all of Jesus's teachings condensed into a sermon, but it isn't one sermon. It's probably all the stuff Jesus covered over the whole 3 years condensed into chapter 5. One great scholar called the Sermon on the Mount the ordination address to the 12. Thoughts about that? I never knew it wasn't one sermon.
I hadn't thought of it as being so focused on the disciples, but that makes sense.
Well, Barclay says it is possible that Jesus actually took the disciples away for a week or two and preached to them privately. Now, it doesn't say that in the Bible, but that is possible, that he took them away and talked to them privately. So
Well,
with the
And I
other
think
thoughts?
there's a comparison somewhere where the Sermon on the Mount was actually tying it back, like we mentioned last week, tying Jesus back to another Moses, being another Moses, because Moses went up to the top of the mountain and got the law and brought
Oh, true. Yeah.
and that now they mentioned on the Mount, he's bringing this new law or his teaching from a mountain. So whether it was always on a mountain or whatever, but I can imagine that it's like a lecture tour or something where you go from one place to another. So this particular sermon may have been spoken all around the Sea of Galilee to different people at different times. I don't know that I ever thought that he might have only said this one time.
I think my Sunday school class is like that because we have people that are Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Catholic, no religion. And Laura Hollis grew up Baha'i. If any of you know anything about Baha'i, it's a very small group that's very accepting of all religions. Pardon me?
Hills and Crofts, the musical group, was
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh, I didn't know that. But very accepting and very global, very worldwide, encompassing, welcoming of everyone. I knew one student who was Baha'i, and she sat beside me on a field trip I took to either the National Aquarium or the National Zoo, I can't remember. And we talked the whole way up and the whole way back. And that's when I learned about Baha'i. But my Sunday school class is like this in the way that I find it very rewarding when people say what I just said to you. I never knew that the sermon, I'm the teacher of the class, and I never knew the Sermon on the Mount wasn't one Sermon on the Mount. I didn't know that, but that happens a lot in our Sunday school class where people say, wow, I never knew that was fill in the blank, whatever. That happens a lot in our class because we come from such varied backgrounds, and many of us have not studied the Bible a lot in my class. So I find that very rewarding. And I like it that I'm 61 and still saying that. So, now Barclay goes into his list of supports for that idea that the Sermon on the Mount was not one sermon. First of all, he says there's far too much information in it for one hearing. Secondly, he says there are certain sections that are totally disconnected from the prior section and the succeeding section, so they clearly wouldn't be connected in a sermon there. They have no connection with what goes before and after. Third, both Matthew and Luke give a version of the Sermon on the Mount, but it's not the same version. And then at the bottom of page 98, he talks about the verses in Matthew and the verses in Luke. And some are similar and some are different, but clearly Matthew and Luke put together different core teachings of Jesus, for lack of a better term.
It's interesting to me that you said there's too much information to hear it all in one presentation.
Yeah.
I think I remember somebody at BCU who was specialized in teaching reading said you have to read a book 3 times. And there's something like that, because the first time kind of gives you an overview of where it's going, what it is. And I'm just thinking here that quite often when you're hearing somebody, a really, really good speaker who has a lot of information to give, I myself get caught up on some idea and I'm still processing that while more really good information is.
Yeah.
And so if I hear that same speaker 3 or 4 times, I'm hearing things I never heard before.
I found myself as a young person, of course, you guys know I read avidly, buying the same books I read 15 years before. So about 30 years ago, I started keeping a 3x5 card index box that I literally take with me to Barnes and Noble. And if this book sounds interesting, I look it up and I'm like, oh, I read that in 1982. That's why it sounds interesting. And I put it back on the shelf because I was bringing home books I'd already read.
Yeah, I've done that before, but and I have to tell a story about something Kathy said several years ago. I was going to deliver the sermon. You know, Cindy was out of town or something, and I, for some reason, didn't have a lot of time. You know, frequently Cindy will call me a month in advance or more and say, "Can you preach?" But there have been times where it was like, "Sarah, can you preach in 5 days?" Well, I pulled one out of my file, and Kathy was going to miss. For some reason, Kathy wanted to read it. So I gave it to her to read and she read it. And then I think thought she was going to miss church. And then she was able to come and hear it.
Oh, yeah.
She said that she got totally different things out of hearing it than what she had gotten out of reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh.
That has to do with the delivery.
I remember now when you were talking about, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I have read Silas Marner 3 times now. The first time I read it was 9th grade English, and I absolutely hated it. I reread it 2 summers ago, and I cried and cried and cried. It meant something totally different.
I haven't read it at all. I might have to read it.
Oh, Silas Marner's really good.
I was getting ready to say, how did you get through school without reading Silas Marner? But I guess that's the difference between North Carolina and Virginia.
Yeah, it's on the 9th grade reading list for Virginia, not Carolina.
Okay.
You probably read great books we didn't read.
Yeah.
I had to read Moby Dick in the 4th grade.
Ugh,
Oh, Lord, no.
but
Well, I think that speaks to life experience, you know. I mean, you could say, I read the Bible when I was 12 years old. You know, or anything of any value. That's why I think masterpieces are the things we consider are masterpieces.
Yeah.
Are the things that keep speaking to us all through our life, and they always tell us something new.
You never step into the same river. You know, the river's always changing.
Right.
yeah,
Well, look, you know, and this is an ancient spiritual practice called Lectio Divina. You know, and we've talked about it there's been retreats done it, and Cindy's talked about it, where it basically is the passage you read 3 times. And each time you look and you listen and you pause and you listen, think about.
Also the Bible, where you read something and then the next verse is repeating and repeating the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, at the top of page 99, Barclay says Matthew is essentially teaching the gospel. The Sermon on the Mount is not one single sermon which Jesus preached. It is the summary of his consistent teaching to his disciples over time, which is, of course, how we learn things, through repetition. And then if you manually manipulate something or physically do something, you learn it even better.
Well, if you have a reference Bible, all right, most reference Bibles in the margin, it has these other citations.
Right.
And so if it has 2 parallel lines next to the citation, that means, that it's pretty similar in that passage in another book. And so as you just glance through the margin of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, you can see that, those verses, many of those verses, how they're in very different places in Luke and in Mark, a lot of those verses. And so then that sort of helps pull it together, that, how each of the Gospels organize this material in a little bit different way,
So we're going to finish today with Matthew chapter 5, 1 and 2, and we'll pick up next week with verse 3. But let's finish the real significance of the Sermon on the Mount. Barclay says is, number 1, Jesus began to teach when he sat down. Jewish leaders would walk around and talk and speak, but when they sat down, they were serious, and that was when everybody got quiet and you listened. That was the real teaching. So his really official teaching was done when he had taken his seat. And when it says Jesus sat down, that's when the real teaching began. Number 2, when he had opened his mouth, he taught them. And what that means is he's grave, he's dignified, he's serious. It's intimate teaching with no barriers between them. And what it made me think of is when somebody leans over and they lower their voice and they tell you a ghost story, and everybody gets quiet and you're intent and you're close and you're listening. I mean, imagine the level of learning that would happen that way. So that's what number 2 made me think of. Intimate teaching, small group. And then number 3, he taught them by saying. And what this means is continuous and often repeated. So he constantly repeated, saying over and over and over and over, because like I said earlier, there were no notes, there were no text. So he had to repeat it many, many times, because these 12 guys were going to go out, and he knew, start this religion and pull in people, and he needed them all to be on the same page. Matthew has said plainly that the Sermon on the Mount is not one sermon of Jesus given at one particular, I'm at the bottom of 100, page 100. Sermon on the Mount is not one sermon of Jesus given at one particular time on one particular occasion. It is the essence of all that Jesus continuously and habitually taught his disciples. The Sermon on the Mount is greater even than we think. It is the official teaching of Jesus, the summary of the teaching which Jesus habitually, repeatedly gave to his inner circle. And I really enjoyed the fact that I got to teach that part and not the etymology. Good luck next week.